Hi guys, it's Homework Gaming. Today's day 8. Today's August 27th, 2025. What I want to do today is a reading for tomorrow. Hello? Hey, alright, you're starting to piss me off. Okay, so this reading called How Racism Works, Scientific Truth. This is for the class Doing Good. It's the Humanities class. And then also, review grammar rules again. If it opens. I may have it downloaded, actually. That's not it. That's not it. Yep, and it's not it, and it sucks, and I hate myself. Sorry. I'm gonna open it. Okay, there we go. I'm doing the reading first. This time I'm gonna read to myself, okay? I'm not gonna read it aloud, because I noticed that by reading it aloud, I don't actually process the words, because I'm too focused on saying them aloud. I wanna actually read it properly. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mumble when I do it. So at least anybody who is genuinely unironic, I hope nobody's using this as whatever background white noise. But if you are, you will hear me mumble. Just so you don't have to. I mean, I might get silent. So who knows? We'll see. We'll see how this goes. Okay, so how racism warps scientific truth on natural selection. And this is it's also called bitch media. I really like that. My great-grandmother was a Blackfeet botanist. She taught us that mark is an analgesic. What the fuck does that mean? Drug use for pain management. Oh, that's nice. Numbs the pain. Willow bark is analgesic pain reliever, and that valerian root helps to calm anxiety and treat insomnia. I grew up picking these root and plant medicines with my aunts, grandmothers, and cousins. Making root medicine is a much more involved process than picking up Tylenol at a grocery store. You have to know what time of the year and time of day to pick, how to clean, dry, and process the plant, and how long it can be used as a tea or rub before its potency starts to fade. My family used these plants as medicine for thousands of years because they work. So why are traditional Native American ecologists, botanists, geneticists, and more cast aside as mythics? Oh, mystics. Science has been studied by people around the world for millennia. When we talk science today, we often discuss peer-reviewed research conducted by university professors or scientists at huge national agencies. There's an assumption that scientific truths are not only strongly supported by evidence, but also largely unbiased, nonpartisan, and universal. As with all aspects of Western society, however, science is deeply tainted with the legacies of colonialism and racism. Despite its contributions, Western science has viciously exploited marginalized communities through forced experimentation and worked to discredit non-Western scientific thought. Its truth comes with an asterisk. The quote-unquote science of race. Social Darwinism, which applies to a scientific theory to a non-scientific realm, was developed in the 1850s by British scientist and philosopher Herbert Spencer. The idea posits what? Success to assume something as a basic factor principle. Yeah, it's the first time in my life I hear that. The idea posits that, similar to Darwin's theory on natural selection, some cultures are inherently weaker than others, and thus naturally would be a lower social class and eventually die out, making way for the naturally stronger and more prominent cultures. Unsurprisingly, a social theory was predominantly used to assert the superiority of Western European culture and society. For hundreds of years, scientific racism and the theory of social Darwinism justified racism imperialism, and other violence toward non-white and non-Western communities. Eugenicists took this idea a step further. Eugenics, which has come to vogue in the early 20th century, was considered to be a mathematical science, taking its cues from biologists and genetics who crossbred plants to control their height and color, among other characteristics. As well as with social Darwinism, eugenicists applied a theory related to the natural world to human beings, in this case on selective breeding. In the case of social Darwinism, on the survival of the fittest. The eugenics movement advocated for genetically breeding humans to create perfect people, as well as to extirpate traits they deemed undesirable. In order to breed out undesirable traits, eugenicists supported forced sterilization to predominantly lower-income communities and communities of color. This extreme and overt violence surged in popularity in the 1920s and 30s as xenophobic and racist fears spread throughout the United States. And the movement was also supported by the Supreme Court in 1927 with Buck v. Bell, which ruled that state-sanctioned forced sterilization was illegal. The decision has never been overturned. While scientific racism is today looked at as a relic of a school of thought that is no longer legitimately reasonable, it is important to recognize that for hundreds of years, marking whites as inherently biological superiors considered unbiased truth, and it deeply influenced policy and social thought. Like the science, knowledge, and communities of color, including the national traditional ecological knowledge passed down from my great-grandmother, Western science exists within a cultural context tainted by white supremacist violence. But because that cultural context is viewed as normal, it is seen as absolute, othering and dismissing any other types of scientific knowledge. Another thing too is that Western knowledge is, for the most part, appropriated from the gained knowledge of other groups around the world, discovered by people of other non-white ethnicities, women, people like people of color, right, shit like that, and then framed it as their own work. And that's kind of that this is very related, because this is all in the same subject there, so this is very much related to that. Anyway, experimental exploitation. During slavery in America, enslaved people were frequently used as test subjects and training for medical students. In addition to selling black bodies in labor, there was also an economy of trading black bodies and even specific body parts to hospitals and medical colleges. Enslaved people were seen as disposable and therefore never asked for their consent. And because black people were so dehumanized by the scientific community, this violence was normalized. In a 2015 article titled "How Black Slaves Were Routinely Sold as Specimens" to the ambitious white doctors on the conversation lecture stuff and cutting notes. All of the key training networks and power bases of northern medicine apprenticeships, private practice colleges. Okay. All of the key training networks and power bases of southern medicine operated through slavery's ruthless traffic and exploitation of black bodies. And was expected education and training based on the observation, dissection, and experimental treatment of black bodies. The observation, dissection, experimental treatment of black bodies. The use of black people for scientific studies also often helped to justify white supremacy and racial hierarchy. Not only were black people's bodies violently abused and exploited, but their psyches were demonized as well. In 1851, Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright coined the then accepted word drapetomania to pathologize the mental state of slaves who escaped or attempted to escape slavery. Similarly, Cartwright argued that a slave's disobedience or refusal to work could be explained by a mental disorder called I'm not even going to try that. Dysesthesia aethiopica. That's right. Slaves' resistance to bondage and white violence was seen as legitimate diagnosable mental disorder. That's fucking crazy. At the time, medical experimentation on black people was legally acceptable because slaves were property and they could be sold at the will of their owners. But long after slavery, the U.S. government continued to use communities of color as testing grounds for experimentation. In the 30s, collaboration with Tuskegee University and the U.S. government purposely infected thousands of black men in Alabama with syphilis and left them untreated for 4 decades in order to track the course of the disease. Wow. And explore possible treatments. In the 40s and 50s, Johns Hopkins University purposely infected orphans, mental health patients, and incarcerated people in Guatemala with syphilis and other STDs. Hundreds of Guatemalans were currently suing Johns Hopkins for having been not only purposely infected, but also denied medical treatment. Such experiments have also been conducted on children of color. In the 40s and 50s, 6 government-run boarding schools in Canada forced their Indigenous students into nutrition experiments. Jesus. Some students were fed a regular diet, whereas others were fed mere vitamin supplements or nutrient-enhanced flour. The children were also denied dental care, even if it had been previously available to them. One of the disturbing goals of these studies was to observe how the human body reacts to malnutrition. Oh my fucking god. At the Guatemalans suing Johns Hopkins, many of these children are alive today. They and their families continue to experience the trauma associated with this abuse. Yeah. Another example of scientific abuse of communities of color is the lack of consent and the use of data. The most well-known example of this is the story of Henrietta Lacks, a black woman whose cancer cells were used without her family's knowledge for medical research and commercial purposes for decades after her 1951 death. A similar case occurred in the Havasupai tribe in 1989 when the tribe gave Arizona State University permission to conduct blood tests on tribal members to study diabetes risk. After the study, researchers continued to use the samples along with illegally obtained medical records to study the genetic frequency of inbreeding and schizophrenia in the tribe without the permission of participants. Beyond the betrayal of trust and confidentiality, the study on inbreeding in the community caused distress because of the complex kinship structures and Jesus, dude. Someone spit got caught in my throat. Structures and relational protocol of the Havasupai that have existed for centuries. In 2004, the tribe sued the Arizona Board of Regents, and they reached a settlement in 2010. These acts of violence are not anomalies, but rather part of a calculated and explicit legacy of medical and scientific exploitation of communities of color born from colonial and white supremacist ideals. We must recognize that many Western scientific advancements were made because of the exploitation of communities of color. By creating scientific arguments for dehumanizing the mind and bodies of people of color, this experience not only impacted and exploited individuals themselves, but also had wide-reaching implications for their communities. Decolonizing science. For as long as white people in power have warned people of color in the name of science, people of color has resisted. In her articles in her book of future science, University of Massachusetts Professor Britt Ruser examines the role of science played in the abolitionist movement. Black activists routinely protest the abuse of black bodies for scientific research and recognize the validity of black and indigenous science. Frederick Douglass and Hosea Easton, among others, spoke out against the abuse of black people for scientific research, rightly arguing that this science was the one of obvious racial bias. Sarah Mapps Douglas, a science and art teacher, was one of the original leaders of the Female Literacy Association, a society for black women educators that was created in 1831 for the express purpose of empowering their students. In the 1850s, Douglas began teaching anatomy, physiology, and reproduction to girls at the Philadelphia Institute for Colored Youth. At a time when few black Americans had access to education, Douglas centered the experience of black girls and empowered them through science, a deeply racist space whose false claims were used by those in power to justify white supremacy. Russert calls this movement abolitionist science, as it used the tools of science to inspire new forms of political imagination and transformation. And the Zapatistas are continuing that legacy by examining all scientific knowledge, not just Western, as a means of resistance. The Oh yeah, I think that's Spanish. The easy outline hosted a 10-day conferences. The 10-day conferences in December 2016 and January 2017 discussed the possibility of an anti-capitalist, non-colonial science that works with and for marginalized peoples. The conferences featured workshops on topics such as the role of technology in social movements, food production, health, and patriarchy in nature. One talk was titled, "What Do Females Sing in Environments Where Males Predominate?" The case of frogs and toads. This provided opportunities for scientists and activists to interact as peers, subverting hierarchical structures typically found at science conferences. The ASLIN worked to educate community members and facilitate the creation of community-based scientific research. They strove to imagine indigenous research efforts that center science as a tool just separate from historically elitist and colonial institutions. Native American communities and scientists similarly recognize the power of reclaiming science and embracing traditional knowledge. One of the reasons that indigenous knowledge is delegitimized is that it's often passed down orally instead of recorded in the same ways as Western scientific data. In a 2002 article titled "Weaving Traditional Ecology Knowledge into Knowledge Action," Potawatomi tribal member and Professor Robin Wall Kimmerer notes that precise hawk moth feeding behaviors were recorded and passed down through an Oladam tribal song, same behaviors that Western scientists would observe and track centuries later. The knowledge already existed, but not in a format that Western scientists considered to be legitimate or trustworthy. Unlike Western scientific knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge does not claim to be unbiased. It is deeply entwined with cultural and spiritual knowledge of tribes. Kimmerer advocates for the inclusion of such knowledge in biology education because it offers unique insights and professional and potential models for ecological conversation. She also pushes back against the notion that traditional knowledge is less rigorous than Western science, arguing that both derive from systematic observations of nature, and that the scope of traditional ecological knowledge includes detailed knowledge of population biology, system RNA, successful dynamics, patterns. Throughout the nation, Native American communities are using their tribal knowledge to mitigate climate change, ameliorate community health through revitalizing traditional foods, and address public mental health issues such as young youth suicide. So, like government agencies and universities, including the SUNY College of Environmental Sciences, where Kimmerer is a distinguished teaching professor, have the tribes begun to recognize the significance of traditional knowledge, particularly with fields of conversation and medicine and such pharmaceuticals. As indigenous scientists recently wrote in a letter endorsing April's March for Science, our tribal communities need more culture than better scientists, and at the same time, the institutions of Western science need more indigenous perspectives. The next generation of scientists need to be well positioned for growing collaboration with indigenous science. Thus, we call for enhanced support for inclusion of indigenous science in mainstream education for the benefit of all. Western scientific knowledge is significant and powerful, and has no doubt deeply impacted how we view and interact with the world and the universe. But it is wrought with violent racist histories assumed as truth and presented as for the good of humanity. As Rizzo argues, science is not inherently good or real. It is often the handmaiden of violence and dispossession. For more than 90 years, my great-grandmother helped others use the anti-inflammatory yucca to relieve arthritis, raspberry tea to regulate menstrual cycles, and hundreds of other plants to heal. Her medicinal and ecological knowledge helped keep our tribe strong for generations, despite the government's attempt to suppress this knowledge and rob us of our connection to the land. Yet, even within progressive circles, non-Western knowledge is often not seen as equal. Valuing Western science over the knowledge of indigenous or other communities maintains the colonial and white supremacist perspective that, for centuries, deemed people of color biologically inferior and supported using their bodies and communities as literal test subjects. We must embrace alternative paradigms and scientific philosophies so as not to diminish the possibilities we have to fully confront global global issues with local implications such as climate change, resource management, hunger or disease propagation. Indigenous communities and communities of color. Deep scientific knowledge is too powerful to continue to ignore. Okay. Alright, that's that. I'm going to move on to just reviewing this. We did this yesterday, so what I'm going to try and do is like read the top, like the title of the slide. And it should just like, you know, make an educated guess on what I think it is, because I already know it. So that's basics. So, right, so, okay, I didn't see it. Okay, subject and verb, right? A complete sentence, a standalone sentence needs a subject and a verb. That's basics, right? Okay, independent clauses and dependent clauses, right? So independent clauses are standalone. They don't need something before it to be complete. However, dependent clauses need something before it to make the sentence valid. Right. So yeah. We did that yesterday. Compound, complex. Compound is when two standalone sentences form and make one big sentence. Complex uses an independent and dependent clause. I'm gay. Sorry. Common mistakes. Okay, well, let's see here. Comma splice and run-on. Okay, comma splice. Comma splice, I think, is when a comma is where a period should be. And then run-on sentences is when there's just no punctuation at all where there should be. I like coffee. Period. Helps me stay awake in the morning. Okay, the concert was amazing. Period. The band. Okay, yeah. Okay. Comma separates. Okay. Separate independent from dependent clauses. Can be used after the fanboys words, which includes and, but, you know, while, for, you know, stuff like that. There we go. Period. Finishes a sentence. Pretty easy. Colon. Okay. Either to begin a list in the middle of a sentence, or you could use it also to quote in the middle of a sentence. Semicolon. Ah, shit. Okay, semicolon. Fuck it. Right, yeah, okay, so if it's two independent clauses that are tightly related, you could do a semicolon. It's kind of like, okay, semicolon is kind of like spices. You don't want to, like, throw it all into it, like, because my teacher told me a lot of professors really don't like seeing this in bulk, and so they have, like, a semicolon limit. Some people do, like, one or two per paragraph. Some professors do, like, one or two per essay. That's how scarce you should be with semicolons. Don't put it all over the fucking place. M dash. Comma on crack. Dramatic effect. That's what it is. Apostrophe. I know what an apostrophe is, dude. 10-minute break. Okay, I'm gonna go touch myself. Okay, guys, I did the same joke as yesterday. I didn't actually touch myself. I just paused it and unpaused it immediately. Writing. Okay, that. Alright, that's all. I'll see you guys tomorrow for day 9. Bye-bye.